Okay, so we're here for our post-teaching observation feedback, and I just wanted to check in with you about a few things that I observed and some things that I had questions about. Prior to the lesson, you had mentioned your objectives, and we talked about what you were getting ready to teach and how you were going to go about doing that during that pre-conference. And so I noticed that they weren't posted, and if so, maybe I didn't just see where they were, but what did you have those objectives posted?
So I didn't have the objectives posted, and I thought about that afterwards. I feel like it's difficult for me to keep up with them, so it was a habit that I had that I stopped doing, but now I realize that it's probably better to have them up on the wall, so if someone were to come into the classroom, they would kind of know what the objectives are. I know the value in it, but it's a habit that I kind of fell away from, and it's something I feel like I need to get back to, so that's a really great suggestion.
Okay, awesome. So also prior to the activity, you highlighted some of your strengths, which I most certainly agreed upon, and that being your lesson planning and your overall ability to organize and have your materials ready, and that you wanted to also, as an area for improvement and growth, highlight ways that you can differentiate, making sure that you're meeting the needs of all learners. And so as we kind of go through this conversation and post-interview, some of the things that I was actually looking for was a differentiated component. So I have a few questions that will kind of pull out some of the things that I'm seeking. Okay. First of all, what do you feel like went really well in your lesson that you were teaching the children the other day that I had the opportunity to observe?
Okay, so I had the opportunity to go back and look at some of their papers that they completed at the end of the lesson, the things that they did independently. I noticed that quite a few of the students who had struggled prior to were making gains, and a couple of them had reached mastery according to that paper. However, there's one more follow-up that I want to do so that I can show a couple different examples of how they've reached mastery. I noticed that a few of the children that I was worried about maybe losing focus because it's a skill that they've already mastered, that might get a little bit boring for them. So I feel like having that opportunity to work with partners went really well. And so...
Oh, I noticed that, and I was going to ask you about how you structured that partnership, because it went really well.
So the tables that I have in the classroom are set up so that way there are partners who are a little bit on the stronger side and partners who could use a little support from time to time. It was a strategic move with their assigned seats. I've kind of tweaked them as the years have gone on. So that way, whenever I ask them to work with an elbow partner, they don't really realize that they're working with a student who may need a little help from another student, and that way the students who get the support or who need the support get a little extra help, even if it's not from an adult. Sometimes the students do really well learning from one another. So they worked with an elbow partner at their table, and then there was an absent student, so I was able to move in, because I have an odd number of students, so I was able to move a student into their seat in order to fill that gap.
Okay. But I liked that pairing, and it was evident that it was very successful.
Oh, fantastic.
And an opportunity for the stronger ones to shine,
Sure.
and the struggling ones to get a little support from someone who kind of was a little bit more on target.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. If you were to teach this lesson again, what would you possibly do? A little bit differently, or tweak, or shift in your thinking and planning?
So I noticed, so the lesson itself was a reteach, so I was teaching some of the content in a different way by allowing them to use manipulatives in a different way. So they have had experience with different kinds of manipulatives, and I think the exposure to multiple different types of manipulatives is kind of what confused them in the first place. So by allowing them to use the same manipulatives over and over again with practice was helpful. Being able to use those rods and cubes really kind of worked for some of the students. It didn't happen on this particular day, but other lessons, manipulatives can also be used inappropriately. And I was a little bit afraid of that, particularly with students who kind of are comfortable with the standard. I didn't happen to notice it this time, so I feel like it went well overall. Going forward, maybe a reminder about how to use the tools appropriately and when to use them so that they don't become a distraction would be helpful.
So I noticed those math kits that you had, the materials and supplies that you had neatly organized in them, and it seemed like you had pretty well established norms in terms of how to use them, when to use them, and using them appropriately. So it seemed like your ability to lesson plan and organize, and then also establish how we use them, I thought went really well.
Thank you.
That was very
I appreciate
successful. Can you talk a little bit about the reteach lesson and how you determined that this particular standard was one that needed reteaching, and what made you decide to do it for the whole class? Like, did the whole class need it, or did you feel like people were benefiting from it as opposed to small group for reteach?
Sure. So in gathering information for our standards-based report card, there are certain lessons that I target as lessons that I felt were are appropriate for all of the students. A lot of the students who had reached mastery at this point on this standard, it was known. However, after the end of the unit, we gave a summative assessment for grade 1, and there were some students who weren't quite reaching mastery. So I targeted a few lessons that could review that skill, and I pulled out some resources that could help. The math kits were very helpful.
Yeah.
Those weren't part of the original lesson when I originally taught something similar. So it was helpful to be able to use something a little bit more consistently with them in a different way. So the students who I was concerned about had a few opportunities for small group lessons with me on those skills, so that way when they sat down for the lesson as a whole group, they had gotten a little extra support off on the side. And now I have a piece of evidence that I can use for all of the students that's the same to kind of report out on for their standards-based report cards.
Okay, all right, great, excellent. What are your next steps for students who you found needed additional support once you reviewed that data?
So a few of them are students who have already been identified as needing additional support with earlier skills, more foundational skills. In that way, as much as I hate to say it, I wasn't surprised that they had trouble with this, because they're having trouble meeting more entry point type lessons with this standard. So a few of them have already been referred for Tier 2 interventions in our building to receive a little bit of extra time with the math interventionist or the math tutor. One student stood out as mastering it right away, who is receiving that level of support, and one student stood out as needing that support and doesn't already have it. So I met with the math interventionist and the math coach, and I reported out the information that I got from both the assessment and from the reteach lessons, and we tweaked some of our small groups so that at least for the remainder of the year they'll get this support. I also reached out to our family coordinator, and she's going to arrange so that their incoming teacher next year will know that they had a little bit of trouble with the standard, because this is the end of the year, so it's the last time they'll receive this type of instruction, and then that way they can kind of maybe push in for a little bit of extra support right at the beginning of the year, so that they're caught up to their peers.
Oh, right, great way to plan ahead. So we spoke of the formative assessments and the summative assessments, but what about, can you speak a little bit to the scaffolds and the accommodations or modifications that you use, particularly with this lesson, but even activities, lessons, or standards that I'm not necessarily observing? What are the different resources that you are able to access?
So at this point in the year, I feel like my students are at a point where they can do a lot more independently than they were at the beginning of the year, where this is a standard that they've built on and built on and built on throughout the year. They've been given different ways of learning. A lot of it has followed a very structured I do, we do, you do model.
I noticed that. That was excellent.
And the students had just had experience working with math centers, which there's a bunch of different activities that they can work on, not independently but with a partner, and they go from table to table and work on different activities. Some include dice, some include number lines, some include hundreds grids, so they're exposed to different materials, different strategies, there's different activities involved. And so this lesson was one of the first lessons following that experience. We did about 4 weeks of that. While those centers were being done, I was working with a small group. Every day I met with the struggling students for a larger portion of that structured work time. But when I wasn't working with the groups the group of students who were struggling, I did give a little bit of enrichment for the students who needed the enrichment. So the group that was working with me was always working at their own level, and that's where those students who had a hard time were kind of getting the one-on-one or small group support to kind of build them up to where their peers are at.
Okay, all right, excellent. That's terrific. How have you found the support from the coaches that we utilize here in the building?
So they are phenomenal.
Okay.
Our
Can you be
math
specific in some examples of them, the
Sure.
push in or the pull out, and what seems to be working
Sure,
best?
of course. Our math coach is out on a maternity leave,
Okay.
but she has actually, I've taught grade 1 math for a few years now, and she's been an excellent support in structuring lessons, in kind of telling me where to beef up certain lessons. We do have a resource available to us so that there is some consistency in the district, which is the Eureka Math Model. One year, a couple years ago, we kind of broke down all the lessons and pulled out the parts that were really important, particularly when it comes to skills that they'll need in the next grade level. Certain lessons I might have skipped because I didn't really feel the level of importance for it, but then I've noticed that that they needed it come down the line in grades 2 or 3. So she was able to help me kind of really figure out the parts of the Eureka model that they'll need to know for future grades. And then we pulled out pieces that aren't really necessary. As I've taught every year, I've kind of changed things so that I've made it more my own. So with her help, it's kind of become a well-oiled machine.
Okay. All right, great.
The interventionists and the tutors have been exceptional in terms of providing the level of support. They're consistent, they're on time. We meet regularly to talk about how students are doing and tracking their progress. And like I said, I was able to talk to them after this reteach lesson and kind of point a couple of students in their direction that weren't already on their radar,
Okay.
Based on the reteach
So I had
results.
a specific question on one student that I was sitting adjacent to, and she seemed to really be struggling with an addition problem, say 7 plus 2, and instead of 7, 8, 9, 2 more, she drew out the 7 and then drew out the 2, and it took her a long time, and then she kept getting distracted. And so she hasn't quite yet moved beyond the concrete level. How do you see yourself or your role in the coach's role in getting her to that next point?
So this is something she's been struggling with for a little bit of time now. It's actually a student who's newer on the radar. There were certain lessons that kind of lent themselves to her strengths a little bit more. So I've asked the coach or not the coach, the interventionist to meet with me. I'm concerned about sending her off for the summer. Still at that level. I'm hopeful that maybe between the interventionist and I, we can come up with some activities or even some games that are common, so we can refer them to her family in the hopes that maybe she uses them at home over the summer. I've also really kind of worked with her family to get her involved in a summer program.
Excellent.
Through one of our community partnerships.
And has that been well received from the family?
It has been. The parent was concerned that she has siblings who might not qualify, and so we were able to find another program for her that the youngest sibling can go into. So that way all of the children are in a program for the same duration every day. And so just being able to communicate with the parent and find out the reasons why she wasn't signed up helps in that regard.
All right, excellent. Prior to the lesson, you asked me to check in on your talk time, and if you were doing too much teacher talk and not giving the kids an opportunity. And my observations, you gave them an extraordinary amount of time, and a very appropriate amount of time. And one of the things that I noticed, which was really fantastic observing, was that you presented a problem and you gave them adequate struggle time. And it wasn't, because sometimes that struggle time can go a little bit too long and then they get antsy. But as I was watching the whole class, they were all completely engaged and they were struggling with it a little bit. It was the problem where I think it was like 4 plus 3 equals 7 plus something, and it was either wrong or right.
Excuse me.
Just 1 second. And whether or not they were wrong or right, whether the problems were wrong or right, and then they had to explain and verbalize their thinking. And that prompted them, and that gave them an opportunity to do more of that student talk. So I think you have exhibited a really great balance.
I appreciate that.
In that area.
That's one area, as you can tell, I can talk. And so when you're in the moment, it's hard to keep track of.
Yeah.
And it's also hard to manage the amount of struggle time given to students. Sometimes I feel like I jump in too quickly, so having an outside party observe that is really helpful. So
No,
thank
so
you
I
for that
thought-
feedback. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I thought that was a great balance. Early finishers. What do you do about some of your early finishers? They all seem to be on task and on target, so no one seemed to finish like right away before everybody else. But what kind of plan do you have in place for those kiddos?
So I'm always open to suggestions for early finishers because I do have, like I said, I have a range, so I do have some that finish early. We do have a fluency packet that they are welcome to work with. We also have math books that I will put out on the rug for them, that they can sit on the rug and read a book.